Kimberly Avila disappeared on May 13th, 2017.
We stayed until late searching and looking. She was nowhere to be found.
Her family is desperate for answers.
We need to know what happened. We deserve to know the answer.
Nobody deserves to be put into a cold case folder, brushed off as missing until found.
We put up posters every single day. By next morning, majority of the posters were torn, vandalized, burned. Only her posters.
Sadly, Texas is the deadliest place in the United States for trans women.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Kimberly's last known steps.
I was told that Kimberly was with a man, and then the last they saw was her getting pushed into a car that was driven by somebody else off into the dark night.
I'm not giving up. We're not giving up. Because we love her very much. I just want her home.
The more people who know Kimberly's story, the greater the chance of bringing her home. Share on social media. Get the word out. Help find her. Have you seen Kimberly Avila?
My name's Yvonne Rodarte Avila. I'm Kimberly Avila's sister. Kimberly disappeared on May 13th, 2017. She was only 32 years old. Kimberly was getting ready to go out. I think she was gonna go to a club. She had her makeup on, listening to music and dancing. Around maybe 2:30 in the morning, she said, hey, you know what? Let's go. Give me a ride downtown. And I was like, it's already late. Well, I'm already ready. You know, she was the type, I'm ready. I'm like, well, why don't you just go out tomorrow? Nope. She was very sassy sometimes. And, you know, I remember so clear that she's like, look at me. I didn't get ready like this to stay home. My brother, Ramiro, or Junior, was born male, but she dressed as a woman on weekends, going by the name of Kimberly. That's what made her happy, so we accepted it. We knew when he was growing up that he was gay because he would like to get my mom's shoes, you know, her high heels, dressing up. He was in middle school when he first came out. My youngest brother would play with cars, he would play with my dolls. So we knew, you know, that he was gay. He didn't have to worry about anything. We weren't gonna change him or trade him for anything in the world. He could be, you know, himself. And that's when, you know, he was at peace.
My name is Noe Avila. I am 34 years old, and I'm the youngest out of the Avila family. Kimberly was a great sister to everyone, but he was also a little bit of a brother to me. So to me, he was Junior, and to our family, he was Junior. But to the friends and other families that are not living in our household, he was Kimberly. He was in a loving home. He loved each and every one of us. As far as the family, nothing changed. My father, he's an old school guy, you know, he's one of those macho type of guys, and he always supported my brother.
We had a very good relationship when we were growing up. We'd play hide and seek. That was like one of the major things that he would love to do because he would hide very good. He's very competitive. He would always beat us. But he was that caring type of person, very bubbly type of person. She was just happy all the time. Her thing was just music, dancing. He would say, I'm just gender fluid. You know, I'm one person here, and then the other when I'm out there. And so that night, it was a Friday, so she was ready to go out. That's when she said, give me a ride downtown, and I'll see you in the morning. So I said bye to my mom and my aunts and everybody, and we got in the truck. On our way to downtown, she was very happy, you know, listening to music and dancing. This is where I dropped her off the early morning of May 13th, like around 2:45 in the morning. And I told her, I'll see you in the morning. But I drove around 3 times before I left when I dropped her off because I had this feeling that something was gonna happen. And I told her, let's go. You can come back tomorrow. She said, there's a lot of people out here. I'm not gonna be here alone, which there was a lot of people out there. And I said, come on, let's go. You know, I'll bring you tomorrow. She was like, I'll just be here for a little while. I'll see you in the morning. And I said, are you sure? She's like, yes. But I went home to wait for her, and she never came home.
When I woke up the morning of May 13, that's when I started talking to my mom. She relayed the message that Kimberly wasn't returning the phone calls, did not arrive at home, something completely out of the ordinary.
She'd never miss coming home. She would call, and if she didn't have it right, my mom called me and said, are you sure he's not at your house? She's like, no. Then I told my mom, you know, let me know when she gets home, you know. So I waited. You know, my mom kept calling me every hour. There's something wrong. I called every single hospital, you know, asking for her to see if there was any information on her. I gave the description. I was going already into a panic mode. And there was a patrol car right behind Porter High School in the driveway, and I stopped. And I told the officer, you know, this is what's going on. And he's like, I'm already making the report of a missing person.
My name is Derek Garcia. I'm the morning news anchor over here at CBS 4 in the Rio Grande Valley. I've been reporting in the Brownsville area that's right on the southern border of Texas and Mexico. Brownsville is deeply rooted in Hispanic culture. Religion plays a big role here. Because so many people in Brownsville are Catholic, it is difficult for members of the LGBTQ community. Some who have come out have been rejected by their families, and others still have yet to come out because of that fear of being rejected from their family, because the Catholic religion and previous generations are just so deeply against it.
My name is Oscar Raul Lopez. I run a nonprofit called Poderosos to draw attention to the border communities. Brownsville is homophobic and transphobic. So the fact that the Brownsville Police Department actually took the information and started a file is important to note, because people just don't disappear. So Brownsville PD stepped up there. The police chief, the officers were respectful. They took the report down really early into the investigation and started looking into the case. In my opinion, historically, the Brownsville PT hasn't always stepped up to help the LGBTQ plus community. So I was really impressed initially because they were very responsive to the family.
It was a Saturday, so they told me that I had to wait for Monday to speak to a detective. In the afternoon, we all went downtown and we went searching.
We walked the streets of downtown for at least an hour. It was actually my whole family.
The area where Kimberly went missing, Washington Street and 12th, is closer to the International Bridge. The lighting was pretty bad. If you have 2 whole blocks of deserted buildings, that means there's no lights outside of them or inside of them that anybody walking by would feel safer.
I haven't been here in a while, but everything, a lot has changed. There's a lot of lights now. So I was checking to see maybe, you know, something had happened in that place, and I could see something that she had in her purse that maybe was dropped. It's one of the very first places where I went to look. There's a huge trash can that used to be there, and my kids and I dug to see maybe something that would tell us that something had happened there, but nothing. We found nothing. She was nowhere to be found. You know, we stayed until late searching and looking for every alley downtown. So we went home. We went home and waited. Monday, we spoke to a detective. Her name is Melissa Gonzalez. She's like, but do you specifically know what she was doing? No, I don't. You know, that day, I don't know what she was doing. That's when she said, you know, that she was gonna be the detective in the case, that it was a missing person case, that they were gonna keep us posted and updated and go from there. There was a reward issued from the police department for $1,000. They set up the hotline, you know, if anybody had any clues or anybody had seen her, you know, to go ahead and call.
If you know anything about this case, call Brownsville Crime Stoppers at 546-TIPS.
We started learning about Kimberly Avila pretty early on, even before police had gone public. The family had reached out to us hoping that they could get answers. Members of the trans community are no stranger to violence, and sadly, we live in an area where if you check those boxes that Kimberly checks, something could happen to you. For us as journalists, here's a family that is begging for answers, and that's our responsibility as journalists to find them.
A Brownsville man disappears without a trace. Police are now turning to the public for help.
Due to the proximity with Mexico, it's protocol for Brownsville police to check surveillance video at the international bridges. Investigators have been reviewing video of people crossing since this weekend. Still no leads on Avila. Police say every missing persons case is different, but in every one, time is a factor.
We have very little information. We don't have any indication to say that there was any type of foul play.
The initial response from the police department, I definitely was optimistic that, you know, these guys they're gonna get it done.
Anybody working a case similar to this anywhere in the country would very quickly want to look at phone records. And that was the case with the Brownsville PD.
Kimberly had a phone that was not in service. She would use it to take pictures, but the phone that she had with her was not in service. It was disconnected.
Unfortunately, with Kimberly's case, she had no real digital trail. So the police told us that they ran into dead ends very early on.
I walked the streets every single day. I would get out of my house like around midnight and would go home like around 4 o'clock in the morning, walking to see maybe I would see her, to see maybe, you know, somebody would bring her out. And I always went home empty-handed with nothing at all. Nos vamos para la casa a jugar allá. Sí.
Te van a jugar 10 minutos y luego vamos a jugar a la casa.
Okay. Camarón y pino.
Last time I saw Kimberly, it was May 12th. We were having a late dinner with some family members that came from Mexico to visit us.
La Rosa.
When my family comes over from Mexico, you know, we all gather and we play loteria.
It's like bingo, but with different type of characters, you know, like a mermaid or a sun, a moon, you know. Loteria is definitely a tradition for Mexican people, you know. You have to play that. Otherwise, you're not Mexican.
Buena.
Era un día como cualquier día que salía, o sea, no hubo nada extraño, nada más de que él se andaba arreglando. Entonces, yo, para mí no fue nada extraño el que un día me dijo, mami, me quiero vestir de mujer. Yo le dije, está bien, eres como cualquier persona, eres mi hijo y tienes el apoyo 100%.
Para mí es mi hijo y a un hijo nunca se le da una espalda, sea lo que sea. Tiene que ver uno por los hijos hasta que Dios nuestro Señor nos lo recoja. Pero en todo el tiempo nunca le di espalda, nunca me avergoncé de él.
My name is Samantha Montemayor. In the Rio Grande Valley, I was with Gentex, a trans-led organization, and also a community leader activist within the community of the Rio Grande Valley. The first time I met Kimberly, we were at a club, and I remember her. She was always smiling and making jokes. I feel that Kimberly was honored to have the parents she had, the siblings that she has, because they've been so supportive. Bronzeville or the Rio Grande Valley, it's different than any other part in the state of Texas. We're 10 years behind on everything.
We're still living in the world with discrimination, you know. Sometimes it was extremely challenging because of the lifestyle that he had. Something as simple as going to the store and him, you know, just the way he walks or his personality, he was very open, very blunt. But we did encounter a lot of different situations where they used to try to bully him. Unfortunate. And there's a lot of people out there that are closed-minded, that don't understand, you know?
Until our whole community can feel safe and blossom and have full-time employment and housing, then I'm sorry, we're still a really homophobic, transphobic region that needs to be called out. So we joke around the Rio Grande Valley, which is where Brownsville is located, that when people want to move away from here because they want to go to the big city and experience that life and have more opportunities for school and work and just joy and culture and things of that nature, they turn to San Antonio, which we kind of all laugh at because it's just like the border, but bigger. Sadly, Texas is the deadliest place in the United States for trans women. We are #1 for the amount of women who get killed who are trans in our state.
Two days after he went missing and the police opened up the case of a missing person, we started to put up flyers. Myself, all our family members, and even friends started to help us place flyers all over downtown.
These are some of the latest posters Elvira Avila has posted on trees, walls, and storefronts around downtown Brownsville. They picture her son, Ramiro Avila, also known as Kimberly.
Right about May 16th, my staff and I noticed posters in our downtown area with the image of Ramiro and Kimberly, and basically asking that anybody who had information to please call their number and to tell them about their whereabouts. And we haven't stopped working with them since.
We put up posters every single day. By next morning, majority of the posters were torn, vandalized, burned. Only her posters. There's a lot of posters up on the walls, and only hers were damaged, only hers were torn, only hers were vandalized, you know, with a whole bunch of graffiti on her picture. That made us just want to come back more and more and more to see, you know, maybe who did that, to maybe catch the person that was doing that. I had people follow me when I was putting up flyers. When we would put up flyers, my family and I, we would see strange cars, you know, just following us street after street, you know, just watching what we were doing. It was scary. It was hard.
A lot of questions being raised. about why those flyers were being ripped off. Is this the person who knows what happened to Kimberly? Was this a person who was with her?
There was one gentleman who was caught on camera defacing a lot of the flyers on multiple occasions, but when the police did stop them, question them, they determined that he was not a threat.
That was potentially a lead that police were looking into, but ultimately that lead came to a dead end also.
Detectives said that there's a lot of homeless people downtown, and there's a lot of, mentally ill people, so they would blame them.
About a week after her disappearance, a tip came in that Kimberly may have been a sex worker in the downtown area. Police didn't confirm that, but when we went to her family, they told us the truth. Being a sex worker definitely heightened the level of danger of what may or may not have happened to her.
I've always heard rumors, online and stuff like that, but it's something that I've never seen.
They say that he was doing the sex work. Yes, it was something that he did not like to talk about, but I'm not denying it. I just can't tell you what she was doing out there.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. No one deserves to be abducted, killed, go lost, put into a cold case folder, or just brushed off as missing until found, and then ultimately forgotten. Nobody deserves to be forgotten.
It's very hard for our trans women in particular to get meaningful employment and maintain it. So transactional sex is much more common because there aren't really any options. But if you identify as female, but you were assigned male at birth, often you want to be acknowledged as a female, desperately. For them, it's also an affirming thing to go out and do sex work because not only do you like me, but you're willing to pay me.
Kimberly is my best friend. The last time I saw Kimberly was like a month before she disappeared. She was super fun. She was like, she was the nice person. She used to give everything to anybody. Like, you wanted something, here it is, you can keep it. Then she became a sex worker, mainly to help herself, to get some extra money for herself. We used to talk about it, but it's like, I'm no one to judge. So all of our friends, we used to tell her like, hey, just be careful out there. Just be careful because you never know what can happen. Because everybody knows how everything here downtown is. Yeah, it's downtown, it's really dangerous, and a lot of people kind of don't want to come towards this side.
How familiar are you with this hotel and what happens there?
Well, this is the hotel where all the sex workers come. There's 2 hotels. There's the one on the other side. They go inside.
Once they have a customer.
As soon as they get a customer, and...
I mean, that makes so much sense because you pay for the room.
Yeah.
And then you can use it.
Yes. Of course, there's a lot of violence.
So sad because even when they go to the police and ask for help,
police don't do nothing.
I believe that sex work did play a part in her disappearance. But police had no success in talking to other sex workers in Kimberly's case. They were afraid of the police, and then ultimately they were afraid of what happened to Kimberly could end up happening to them.
We know that a few weeks before Kimberly's disappearance, the police had arrested some of the transactional sex workers that worked downtown Brownsville. So the girls were reluctant to talk about what had happened because they were afraid that they were going to be arrested too.
That they just shut down and they never again have spoken about what they may or may not have seen.
Brownsville Police Department has a history of arresting commercial sex workers and their clients in the downtown area. It's a frayed relationship that's only harmed the investigation.
So here come the police, and then now they're coming to us for help. Well, we're not going to cooperate with the police because they're just arrested us or people that we associate with. So what do you do?
Progress in this case has been very difficult because of this history of mistrust between sex workers and the police department. Based off of sex workers that I've spoken to, they wouldn't go to police, period. Doesn't matter what the scenario is. The conversation that I've had with them is to say, well, what's the point? Police aren't going to help us. They never have and they never will. So that fractured relationship between the police and sex workers has absolutely harmed this investigation. They don't want to talk to each other, and they never have, and I don't think they ever will.
Detective Gonzalez would call us almost every day to let us know we have no leads.
It was very disappointing.
So at this point, the case is cold. And then in December 2018, a new lead comes in, and it doesn't come from the media, it doesn't come from police, but instead comes from a blogger on the website El Run Run.
My name's Juan Montoya, and I'm a journalist. I've been a border journalist since '78. My first job was at the Brownsville Herald. Now with the social media, I run a blog spot, like an online newspaper here. We pretty much cover everything, from culture to crime. I keep my ear close to the ground.
Usage of social media has absolutely helped out in investigations. We don't have to just wait for police to give us answers. Internet tipsters, people who watch us can definitely give us those tips, those breadcrumbs, and we take all kinds of tips in a case like this seriously.
Brownsville is a very historical city. It's a very cultural city, but it's also a border city, which implies a lot of issues: contraband, crime, cartels. The underbelly of this city is contained in the little beer joints. They call them cantinas de la muerte. Beer joints of death, for lack of a better term. Kimberly, word of her disappearance got out quickly because she was a regular at these places. And she started not showing up, and her parents started asking, well, where she was at, if anybody had seen her. The people on the street started talking about her missing, and the pictures started going up. I remembered, you know what? I remember seeing this girl. And then as I started talking to people, they started telling me that they had seen her there at that particular bar, walking out with this man. I was told by people that Kimberly was with a man who was associated with a criminal group. Well, that's the person that was seen last with her. And I don't think that the guy actually knew that Kimberly was not a woman. But they bought some beer and they were walking out the door at closing time. And they were getting into an argument because apparently the guy thought Kimberly had stolen something from him. And as they argued along the street, they was demanding something from her loudly, enough to wake people up. And him screaming that to give him something back. And then the last they saw was her getting pushed into a car that was driven by somebody else off into the dark night.
Kimberly Avila was last seen May 13th, 2017. If you have any information, please contact the Brownsville Police at 956-548-7000.
If the suspicions are correct, Kimberly was taken across the border. The people who told me about this person, they know he is. So as much as I tried to prod them into telling me something that could be used to solve disappearance, they were not forthcoming because they thought they would get back to them. Along this border, the retribution is swift. I did go to the police with this information. They took it, and that's the last I've ever heard of it.
Right across the way from Brownsville is Matamoros, where you have a totally different level of crime and violence, rates that are vastly different from what you see in Brownsville. Once you cross into Mexico, who knows what happens next?
There was never any cooperation between Brownsville and the Matamoros police. To this day, there's never been anybody who's gone and said, this week, did you get any, somebody unidentifiable in your morgue? Nothing.
So our faith with the police department, it started not being as good as it was at the beginning.
I want to think that maybe they're just incapable and they can't say it.
New details in the disappearance of a local LGBTQ woman.
June 2019, another tip came in, and that tip must have been important for them to ask the family to hold a press conference at their house to bring all of us together.
Detective Gonzalez did ask us to do a press conference. There was a phone call, a tip that was made.
This morning, today, we are here with the Avila family at their residence. We know that there's people who know or have information on the case and they choose not to come forward.
The strange part about this whole press conference is that the police wouldn't tell the family what the caller said. They didn't want to tell us who this person was or what they said or any kind of descriptors that would entice them to call. So it had a lot of us scratching our heads saying, well, what is all of this about? We pushed police to answer our questions. They did not supply us with a lot of the answers to questions we were having.
We don't know what was said because it wasn't said to us. We don't know if it was a male or a female that called. We were never told what was said on that phone call. Why it's so important, we don't know. All they asked us to do was just to make that plea to the community.
You had a reason to call that day. I'm begging you to call back. We're begging, I'm begging. Our pain is just growing more and more every day. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse.
But nobody ever called back. So the glimmer of hope was so real for the family, and then to have that sort of pulled out from underneath them was pretty heart-wrenching.
I try not to let my sister, my father, my mom, to engage in those tips/rumors. It only adds more sadness, more stress, and then if he's not there, and it's gonna hit you twice as hard.
To this day, we still don't know what that caller said or even if that caller picked up the phone again. After that press conference, radio silence.
As time went on, we didn't get any type of updates. The police department, they were not returning phone calls.
This week marks 2 years since a gender-fluid person was reported missing. The family has criticized investigators for not doing enough.
There's very minimal information that has come up recently, obviously. The longer it takes, the more chances that things will get cold. There's nothing concrete.
The people who have been really keeping Kimberly's story alive are her family. They have gone to every single interviewer. They've gone to every single news station. If somebody with a camera comes up to them, they don't say no. But also, members of the trans and LGBTQ community. And Oscar has gone above and beyond to make sure that Kimberly does not end up in that cold case file column.
My staff and I led the organizing of 2 events every year, which was a birthday celebration of life. We also recognize the day that she went missing as the other day that we sort of acknowledged, and we do it annually. In 2019, we were working closely with the family to have a vigil for Kimberly because she was missing still, and we had no credible leads or anything.
Vigil was here, asking the public for help in searching, looking for Kimberly, letting them know that she's still missing, that we're still looking for her, that we haven't given up.
there is a vigil for Kimberly, and at that vigil is the Cameron County District Attorney, Luis Sáenz. He drops a bombshell on the family using the phrase, "We want to bring Kimberly's killer to justice." And up until that point, the family only knew that Kimberly was a missing persons case. I don't think any of us were prepared because we had never heard anything or any type of tip that Kimberly had been killed.
We were all in shock. You know, my mother was looking at me, my father was looking at me, my brother's looking at me like, you know what's going on? I could hear people mumbling, and my mom started crying, my dad started crying, and we were like, what are you talking about?
I was standing behind the family, and I leaned over to the sister and I said, do you know anything about this? She says, no. And the mother, Kimberly's mother, was in the worst state, because at that moment, every possibility of her coming home was bashed by this man. So I went around the family really quickly up to the police chief and I said, what is he talking about? He goes, I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about. That's the wrong case. I said, you need to tell him because look at what it's doing to the family. So he leaned over, whispered in the district attorney's ear, and the district attorney stopped mid-sentence, literally dropped the mic and ran away, with reporters chasing after him, who followed him all the way back to his office where he got in, locked the door, and wouldn't come out. It's unforgivable what he did, because the family was already in pain and anguish, thinking the worst, and then he says that their child is dead, when it wasn't even the right person. It wasn't the right case, and all it did was hurt the family.
Tonight marks 3 years since a transgender woman went missing in Brownsville, but her family tells CBS 4's Derek Garcia they believe police aren't putting the cold case at the top of their list because of her sexual orientation and her line of work.
No leads, nothing new, still investigating.
And no, we have not been able to develop any leads. I remain committed to the case as if it happened yesterday.
So we're now another year past with Kimberly's case. I think the question is, what do police need? I think they need a lot. I think they need an eyewitness. They need some sort of evidence. And most importantly, they need to know if Kimberly is alive or not. And if she is alive, she needs to come home. And if she's not alive, somebody needs to come forward. Without that, it's going to be another year. What happened to Kimberly, we don't know just yet. But we do know what has happened since she went missing. The LGBTQ community banded together and said, enough is enough.
The city of Brownsville created the first of its kind LGBT task force.
Every cause has an effect, and this was the effect of Kimberly's case. And I think that's a beautiful thing that came from Kimberly's case. I think it is rare for an LGBTQ task force to take effect anywhere on the border, let alone Brownsville, but to see it be born here in Brownsville is a great thing. And just because it's rare doesn't mean that it shouldn't be the norm. More cities can definitely learn from that.
The trans community and the police department have never had a very good communication or interaction. And by having a task force, an LGBT task force that's going to be there to represent you, makes a difference.
It is a bittersweet because we would have loved for her to be here and see the changes, but we're still missing her. You know, she's still not home. So yeah, there's a lot of good things that are coming out, but at the same time is maybe she paid a high price for it.
No, pues yo quisiera decirle que si es que me está viendo, bendito Dios, que vuelva a casa, que es su casa, que todo el tiempo lo ha sido, que estamos esperándolo con ansias, con ganas de verlo otra vez. Y es lo que Dios le pido a mi Dios, que me dé licencia de verlo antes de morirme.
What makes the Avila family so special is that they show up for each other and for Kimberly over and over and over again. Every night is a sleepless night, that wondering where their child is, wondering what's happened to them. but they don't give up and they lift each other up constantly.
Thank you, everybody.
Sometimes I'll tell myself maybe somebody, has her.
The first thing you need to understand about Elizabeth Wettlaufer is that she did not look like a killer. She did not force her way through locked doors in the middle of the night. She did not stalk strangers through dark streets. She did not leave bodies hidden beneath layers of soil or abandoned in the back seat of a car. She wore a nurse's uniform. She walked through quiet corridors where elderly people slept behind half-open doors. She entered rooms where the air was heavy with the familiar smells of medication, disinfectant, warm blankets, and aging bodies. She stood beside beds occupied by people who could no longer walk without assistance, people whose hands trembled when they tried to lift a glass of water, people who depended on someone else to tell them when it was time to take their medication, when it was time to eat, when it was time to sleep. And when one of those people became frightened, confused, or too weak to understand what was happening, a nurse was supposed to be the person they could trust. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was one of those people. For years, she moved through the healthcare system with the authority that came with that uniform. She had access to patients. She had access to medication. She had access to rooms where outsiders could not simply walk in. And she had access to something even more important than all of that: trust. Between 2007 and 2016, that trust would become part of a horrifying pattern of death. 8 elderly patients would ultimately be identified as murder victims. 4 others would be connected to attempted murder charges. 2 more would be victims of aggravated assault. The method was chillingly simple. Insulin was administered in excessive amounts, triggering severe hypoglycemia and, in some cases, death. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the story is not the method. It is how long the deaths could remain hidden. Imagine an elderly patient in a long-term care facility. The person may already have heart problems, diabetes, dementia, kidney disease, frailty, a history of falls, a body that has spent decades accumulating illnesses that doctors and nurses have learned to manage, but never completely erase. In a place like that, death is not an extraordinary event. It is expected. Not welcomed, not painless, not insignificant, but expected. And that reality created a terrible kind of camouflage. When an elderly patient suddenly deteriorated, there were already explanations available. When their breathing became irregular, there was a medical history waiting to make sense of it. When their body began shutting down, there were diseases that could be blamed. When they finally died, the death could appear to belong to the natural order of things. Age, illness, time. 3 words capable of hiding almost anything. And somewhere inside that environment was a nurse who had already crossed a line that no healthcare professional should ever cross. The first confirmed killing attributed to Wettlaufer dates back to 2007. The last known killing occurred nearly a decade later. 9 years. 9 years in which the boundary between caregiver and predator was crossed again and again. 9 years in which people continued to enter nursing homes believing that the people wearing medical uniforms were there to keep their loved ones alive. 9 years in which families said goodbye to fathers, mothers, grandparents, brothers, and sisters without knowing that someone they trusted may have deliberately accelerated the moment of death. And then, in September of 2016, something happened that no detective had managed to make happen. Elizabeth Wettlaufer talked, not because police had cornered her, not because investigators had discovered an overwhelming forensic trail, not because a witness had finally seen something they could no longer ignore. She went looking for help herself. She left nursing and entered the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. Inside that institution, away from the corridors where she had worked and away from the patients whose lives had passed through her hands, Wettlaufer began to reveal what she had done. She told a psychiatrist that she had harmed and killed patients. She described the use of excessive insulin. She spoke about acts that had remained hidden inside ordinary medical routines. Then she wrote it down for pages. For pages that would transform a series of apparently ordinary deaths into something else entirely. An investigation. A reconstruction. A reckoning. Because once those words reached the police, investigators were forced to look backward. They had to revisit places Wetlaufer had worked. They had to examine patient records. They had to look at deaths that had already been mourned, deaths that had already been accepted, deaths for which families had already closed the door on one of the most painful chapters of their lives. And now the question was no longer simply whether Elizabeth Wetlaufer had killed someone. The question was how many. That question would lead investigators into the quiet world of long-term care facilities across southwestern Ontario. It would force them to examine the lives of people whose names had never appeared on a missing person poster, because none of them had disappeared. They had simply died, one after another. And that distinction matters. A missing person creates urgency. A body discovered in a strange location creates suspicion. A violent crime scene demands an explanation. But a frail, elderly person dying in a nursing home can leave behind a completely different atmosphere. There may be flowers beside the bed, family photographs on the wall, a television quietly playing in the corner, a cardigan folded across a chair, a half-finished cup of water, a pair of slippers waiting beside the bed for feet that will never step into them again. There may be grief, but there may not be suspicion. That is the environment in which Elizabeth Wetlaufer operated. And the people she encountered were among the most vulnerable members of society. They could not simply walk away from her. Some could not understand what was happening to them. Some could not speak clearly. Some could not remember. Some could not question a medication decision made by the person standing beside their bed. Their survival depended on the people assigned to care for them. That dependency is what makes this case so difficult to comprehend, because a serial killer who attacks strangers creates fear from the outside. Wetlaufer created something different. She turned care itself into a source of danger. The hand that was supposed to hold a patient's arm could become the hand that caused harm. The person who was supposed to monitor a patient's condition could become the person responsible for making that condition worse. The uniform that represented safety could become the disguise. And yet, looking back, there were signs that Elizabeth Wetlaufer was not an entirely invisible problem. Her professional history contained warning signs. There were concerns about her performance. There were difficulties in her personal and professional life. There were issues involving substance use, mental health, and workplace conduct. People had noticed that she could be careless. People had seen behavior that was not always consistent with the standards expected of a healthcare professional. But noticing that someone is a troubled employee is not the same thing as believing that person is capable of murder. That is where the horror of this story becomes more complicated. The system did not simply fail because no one ever saw anything unusual. People saw fragments. They saw mistakes. They saw problems. They saw a nurse who struggled. But the fragments never became the full picture. No one looked at those warning signs and saw the possibility that an elderly patient might be in danger. So the pattern continued. And the victims continued to disappear into the statistics of old age and illness, until Wetlaufer herself broke the silence. By the time she entered treatment in 2016, the past was already waiting behind her. Names, rooms, medical charts, facilities, dates, patients, families, deaths. All of them connected by one woman who had moved through their lives wearing the uniform of a caregiver. When investigators began testing the truth of her confession, they were confronted with an almost unbearable possibility. What if she was telling the truth? What if those deaths were not natural? What if the people who had been mourned as patients who simply reached the end of their lives had actually been murdered? And if that was true, how many families had spent years believing something that was not true? The investigation would eventually identify 8 murder victims: James Silcox, Helen Matheson, Mary Zurowinski, Gladys Millard, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, Arpid Horvath, Lloyd Keffer. 8 names, 8 lives, 8 people whose stories would eventually become part of one of Canada's most disturbing healthcare criminal cases. But in the beginning, before the names appeared in police files, before courtrooms filled with evidence, before investigators reconstructed years of medical records, each of them was simply a person who had lived, a person who had been loved, a person who had once been young, a person who had once walked through a world that looked completely different. And eventually, each of them became old enough, sick enough, or vulnerable enough to need care from other people. That should have been the safest chapter of their lives. Instead, for some of them, it became the final chapter. The terrible irony is that the killer did not need to gain their confidence. The healthcare system had already done that for her. The family had already done that. Society had already done that. A nurse was expected to be trustworthy. So the question that hangs over this story is not simply, how could Elizabeth Wettlaufer kill? There is another question. How could she do it again? And again? And again? How could the first death disappear into the background? How could another follow? How could years pass without the pattern becoming visible? How could a woman who had already demonstrated professional problems continue to enter rooms where patients were at their most vulnerable? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this. What would have happened if Elizabeth Wettlaufer had never decided to confess? That question would later become central to the public inquiry into the long-term care system. Because investigators eventually concluded that if Wettlaufer had not confessed, her crimes might have remained undiscovered. Think about what that means. The person who finally opened the door to the investigation was not a suspicious colleague, not a grieving family member, not a detective, not a laboratory technician. It was the killer herself. She walked into a place where she could speak. She described what she had done. She put some of it on paper. And with those 4 pages, the meaning of years of death began to change. The quiet nursing home corridors suddenly looked different. The medication records looked different. The patient files looked different. The memories of families looked different. And every unexplained death connected to Elizabeth Wettlaufer became a question waiting to be answered. For nearly a decade, death had been the end of the story. In 2016, it became the beginning. The beginning of a police investigation. The beginning of a painful search through medical records and institutional history. The beginning of a reckoning for a healthcare system that had trusted the wrong person. And the beginning of a story that would eventually force Ontario to confront a question far larger than Elizabeth Wettlaufer herself. Because one woman could be arrested, one woman could be sentenced, one woman could be placed behind the walls of a prison. But the system that allowed her to remain in positions of care for years could not simply be locked away. That system had to be examined. Every warning sign, every missed opportunity, every assumption, every death that had seemed ordinary, every moment when someone might have asked a different question. And before the investigation was over, the story of Elizabeth Wettlaufer would no longer be only the story of a nurse who killed patients. It would become the story of what can happen when trust is given automatically, when vulnerability is mistaken for invisibility, and when death becomes so familiar that no one thinks to ask whether someone caused it. For the families of the victims, however, there was nothing abstract about any of this. There were no statistics, no institutional failures, no policy recommendations. There were only people they loved. And somewhere along the way, those people had entered a healthcare facility believing that the hands caring for them were safe. They never knew that one of those hands belonged to Elizabeth Wettlaufer. They never knew what had happened. Not until much later. And by then, there was only one thing left for investigators to do. Go back. Back through the years. Back through the facilities. Back through the patient records. Back through every death. And ask the question that no one had asked soon enough. What if it wasn't natural? What if someone had been killing them all along? The answer would reveal one of the darkest chapters in Canada's healthcare history. There are some places in the world where death is expected. A hospital room, a hospice, a long-term care facility. Places where families learn to recognize the subtle changes in a body that is beginning to shut down. The slower breathing, the fading appetite, the long hours of sleep, the hands that become colder. The eyes that no longer focus on the faces standing beside the bed. In those places, death does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it comes after years of illness, after decades of living, after a lifetime of memories that have gradually become contained in photographs, letters, old clothes, and stories repeated by family members. And sometimes, when an elderly person dies in a long-term care facility, there is a terrible simplicity to the explanation. They were old. They were sick. Their body could not continue. The family cries. The staff offers condolences. The room is cleaned. The bed is prepared for someone else. Life moves forward. But what happens when the explanation is wrong? What happens when the death that everyone believed was natural was not natural at all? What happens when the person standing beside the bed was not trying to save a life? What happens when the person wearing the uniform, carrying the medication, checking the patient's condition, and speaking to the family with the calm confidence of a medical professional is actually the person responsible for the death? For years, almost nobody asked those questions about Elizabeth Wetlaufer. And that is what makes her story so disturbing. Elizabeth Wetlaufer did not enter the world of her victims as an obvious threat. She entered as a nurse. She had trained for the profession. She had become a registered nurse in 1995. She had spent years working in healthcare. She knew how hospitals and long-term care facilities functioned. She knew the routines. She understood medication. She understood the vulnerability of elderly patients. She understood what happened when a patient's condition suddenly deteriorated. And she understood something else. People trusted nurses. A nurse could enter a room without raising suspicion. A nurse could approach a patient when family members were not present. A nurse could handle medication. A nurse could explain a change in a patient's condition. A nurse could be there when someone became critically ill. The very structure designed to protect vulnerable people also gave Wetlaufer access to them. That contradiction sits at the heart of this case. The more you look at it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because the victims were not strangers walking alone down a street. They were elderly people living in an environment where they were supposed to be protected. Many of them could no longer perform basic tasks without assistance. Some depended on others for medication. Some depended on others to help them eat. Some depended on others simply to get out of bed. Their vulnerability was not hidden. It was the reason they were there. And that vulnerability created the perfect environment for a crime that did not need a weapon that looked like a weapon. There was no need for a knife. No need for a gun. No need for a mask. No need to break a window or force open a door. The method could be concealed inside something that belonged in a medical environment. Insulin. A substance associated with treatment. A substance that, when properly administered, could be part of someone's care. But in the wrong circumstances, excessive insulin could cause severe hypoglycemia and become deadly. That was the method investigators would eventually connect to Elizabeth Wetlaufer. But investigators did not discover it immediately. They did not walk into a crime scene and see the unmistakable evidence of murder. There was no dramatic tableau waiting for police. Instead, there were deaths. Quiet deaths. Medical deaths. Deaths surrounded by charts and diagnoses and years of illness. And that distinction would become critical. Imagine the room of an elderly patient. Perhaps there are photographs beside the bed. A younger version of the patient smiles from a frame. A wedding photograph. A family portrait. A photograph of children who have since grown old themselves. Perhaps there is a television in the corner. Perhaps there are clothes folded carefully on a chair. Perhaps there is a small object brought from home because it makes the unfamiliar room feel familiar. The patient has spent days, months, or years in that room. The staff knows their routines. They know which foods they prefer. They know when they usually wake. They know whether they complain about pain. They know which family members visit. They know how they react to medication. And then, one day, something changes. The patient becomes unwell. The staff responds. People move around the bed. A medical explanation is considered. Perhaps everyone believes the patient's body has simply reached its limit. And eventually, the room becomes quiet. The family is called. Someone says the words every family eventually fears. Your loved one has died. There may be tears. There may be embraces. There may be questions. But the most important question may never be asked. Why? Not because nobody cares, not because nobody loved the patient, but because the death appears to make sense. The patient was elderly. The patient was ill. The patient was already receiving long-term care. The patient had been declining. There is a logic to the death. And when a death fits the story everyone already believes, people are less likely to look for another story. That is how a pattern can hide in plain sight. One death becomes an individual tragedy. Another death becomes another tragedy. A third does not necessarily connect the first two, especially when the patients are elderly and medically fragile, especially when the person involved is not a stranger, but a professional caregiver, especially when the deaths occur over years rather than days. Between 2007 and 2016, Wettlaufer would become connected to a series of deaths and serious assaults. 8 people would ultimately be identified as murder victims. 4 others would be connected to attempted murder charges. 2 more would be connected to aggravated assault. 14 serious criminal charges in total. But those numbers only became visible after investigators had a reason to look backward. Before that, there was no single crime scene. There was no single night when everything happened. There was no obvious moment when the story announced itself. Instead, the story was scattered across years, across facilities, across patient records, across memories, across families who had already said goodbye. And somewhere inside those years was Elizabeth Wettlaufer, a woman whose professional life had not been entirely free of warning signs. Her workplace history contained problems. There were concerns about her performance. There were issues involving her personal life, substance use, and mental health. There were moments when her conduct or competence had raised concerns. But those concerns were not interpreted as evidence of something far darker. That distinction is important. It is easy, after a crime has been discovered, to look backward and convince ourselves that the warning signs were obvious. They rarely are. Before a terrible event, a troubling employee may look like a troubled employee. A careless nurse may look like a careless nurse. Someone struggling with addiction may look like someone struggling with addiction. Someone experiencing mental health problems may simply appear to be a person in distress. None of those things automatically means murder. And that is why hindsight can be dangerous. The question is not whether every person who saw Wettlaufer should somehow have known she was capable of killing. The harder question is whether the system had enough information to recognize that something was seriously wrong. That question would become much more important after her confession, because the confession changed everything. In September 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer entered the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. By then, something had apparently reached a breaking point inside her. For years, she had lived with whatever thoughts, impulses, guilt, or psychological turmoil had accompanied her actions. Now she was seeking treatment, and inside that setting, she began to speak. She told a psychiatrist that she had harmed and killed patients. She described using excessive insulin. She was no longer simply a nurse with a troubled professional history. She was describing a series of acts that, if true, meant multiple elderly patients had not died naturally. They had been deliberately harmed. And then came the moment that transformed the investigation. She wrote a confession. For pages of handwriting that would give investigators a starting point for a case that stretched back years. The significance of those pages is difficult to overstate. Before them, there were deaths. After them, there were potential murders. Before them, there were patients who had died. After them, there were victims. Before them, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was a nurse. After them, she was a suspect in a series of killings. And the police had to determine whether her story was true. That was not a simple task. A confession is powerful, but investigators still have to test it. They have to determine whether the person confessing is telling the truth. They have to identify the victims. They have to reconstruct what happened. They have to compare the confession against medical records. They have to examine where the suspect worked. They have to establish timelines. They have to determine whether the deaths could have been caused by something else. And perhaps most importantly, they have to find out whether the confession describes isolated acts or a pattern. The answer would be devastating. The investigation began to move backward through Wettlaufer's professional history. The places where she had worked became important. The patients she had cared for became important. The deaths that had once seemed separate began to sit beside one another in a new context. And suddenly, the ordinary details of nursing care became potential evidence. Who had been present? Who had access? What medication had been available? What had happened shortly before a patient's condition changed? What had happened before the patient died? What did the medical records say? What did the family remember? What did coworkers remember? And how many times had Elizabeth Wettlaufer been there? That last question may have been one of the most frightening, because she was not an outsider passing through. She belonged there. She had a legitimate reason to be in those rooms. She had a legitimate reason to approach those patients. She had a legitimate reason to handle medication. She had a legitimate reason to be present when someone became sick. The system had given her access because that access was necessary to provide care. She turned that access into an opportunity to harm, and the victims had little ability to defend themselves. That is what separates this case from the image many people have of a serial killer. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, no stranger approaching a victim in an alley. There was a bed. There was a nurse. There was a patient. And there was trust. That was enough. For the families, the discovery would have another layer of pain. Learning that someone you love has died is devastating. Learning years later that their death may not have been what you believed is something else entirely. Grief is built around memory. People remember the final days. They remember the last conversations, the last visit, the last time they held someone's hand, the last time they said goodbye. They try to construct a story that makes the loss understandable. And then, years later, someone tells them that the story may have been wrong. The death was not simply the inevitable ending of an elderly person's life. Someone may have caused it. Someone they had trusted. Someone employed to care for people like their loved one. That realization can reopen grief in a completely different form. Anger. Confusion. Guilt. Questions that cannot be answered. Why didn't anyone notice? Why wasn't the death investigated? Was there something we missed? Could we have done something? Could someone else have stopped it? Could our loved one have been saved? These questions are impossible to escape once the past has been rewritten. And there is another question that hangs over the case. How many people might have remained vulnerable if Wettlaufer had never spoken? The later public inquiry into Ontario's long-term care system would examine that possibility in extraordinary detail. Its purpose was not simply to understand what Elizabeth Wettlaufer had done. It was to understand how the environment around her had allowed the pattern to continue. The inquiry would eventually produce 91 recommendations aimed at improving the safety and security of residents in long-term care. But those recommendations came later. First came the investigation. First came the names. First came the realization that 8 people were not simply 8 elderly patients who had died. They were 8 victims. James Silcox, Helen Matheson, Mary Zurowinski, Gladys Millard, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, Arpid Horvath, Lloyd Keffer. 8 people. 8 lives. 8 families. And behind each name was an entire history that existed long before Elizabeth Wettlaufer entered it. That history matters, because true crime stories can sometimes reduce victims to numbers. 8 victims. 4 attempted murders. 2 aggravated assaults. 14 charges. But numbers do not tell us who these people were. They do not tell us what they loved. They do not tell us who visited them. They do not tell us what they were like when they were younger. They do not tell us what their families saw when they looked at them. They do not tell us what was lost. And perhaps that is the first thing that must be remembered when telling this story. Elizabeth Wettlaufer is the person whose name became internationally known. But this is not her story alone. It is the story of people who were supposed to be protected. It is the story of families who trusted a healthcare system with people they loved. It is the story of a profession built around the preservation of life. And it is the story of what happens when one person takes that trust and turns it into something horrifying. The most chilling part is that, for years, nothing about the corridors where these people lived necessarily looked like a crime scene. There were no flashing police lights, no yellow tape, no detectives standing outside the doors. There were ordinary mornings, ordinary meals, ordinary medication rounds, ordinary conversations, ordinary routines. And within those routines, something extraordinary and terrible was happening. That is what makes the Elizabeth Wettlaufer case so difficult to forget. The horror was not hidden in some remote place. It was hidden inside normality. And normality is one of the hardest disguises to recognize. For nearly a decade, the deaths could be separated by time, place, medical history, and circumstance. Then one confession connected them. A confession written on 4 pages. 4 pages that forced investigators to look at the past through completely different eyes. The quiet rooms were no longer simply rooms where elderly people had died. The medication was no longer simply medication. The records were no longer simply records. And Elizabeth Wettlaufer was no longer simply the nurse who had been there. She was the common thread, the woman who had been allowed into the lives of vulnerable patients because everyone believed she was there to help them. And now investigators had to find out exactly what she had done. They had to walk backward through almost 10 years of history. They had to revisit deaths that families had already buried. They had to separate coincidence from pattern. They had to determine which patients had been harmed and which deaths could be linked to deliberate acts. And eventually, they would have to stand in court and confront the reality of what had happened. But before that came the hardest part, remembering the dead. Because before Elizabeth Wettlaufer became a name associated with murder, the people whose lives she entered had names of their own. They had families. They had memories. They had stories. And for the first time, investigators were about to uncover those stories from beneath the assumption that their deaths had simply been part of aging. The investigation was about to begin. And when it did, the past would not remain quiet. Every patient record had a story. Every death had a date. Every workplace had a history. Every family had a memory. And somewhere inside all of it was the truth. A truth that had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Not, why did this elderly person die? But something much darker. Who was standing beside the bed when they did? The last person an elderly patient expects to fear is the person standing beside their bed. A nurse is supposed to be the person who notices when something is wrong, the person who checks a patient's condition, the person who brings medication, the person who answers when someone calls for help, the person whose presence is supposed to mean that, even in the final years of life, someone is still watching. But what if the person watching is the danger? What if the hand reaching toward a patient is not reaching out to save them? What if the medication being brought into the room is not being used to make someone better? And what if the person responsible is someone who has been trusted for years? That is where the story of Elizabeth Wettlaufer begins. Not in a dark alley. Not in an abandoned building. Not with a stranger following someone home. It begins inside the world of healthcare. A world built on routines. A world built on trust. A world where elderly people are often surrounded by professionals because they can no longer care for themselves. For the families of those patients, placing a loved one in long-term care is rarely an easy decision. There is often fear involved, guilt, uncertainty, the quiet hope that, despite the difficulty of growing old, their mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, brother, or sister will be safe. They trust the people who work there. They trust the nurses. They trust the doctors. They trust the system. And when an elderly person dies, families may tell themselves that the death was part of the natural order of life. The person was old. The person was sick. The person had been declining. The person had reached the end. There is comfort, however painful, in believing that explanation. Because sometimes there is nothing more frightening than discovering that the death you accepted was not the death you thought it was. For Elizabeth Wettlaufer's victims, that possibility would remain hidden for years. Wettlaufer was born in 1967 in Ontario. She eventually became a registered nurse in 1995 and spent roughly 22 years working in nursing. On paper, that career placed her in a profession built around one fundamental principle: protect life, care for the vulnerable, respond when someone is in danger. But behind that professional identity, there were problems. Her personal and professional life contained instability. There were issues involving substance use and mental health. There were workplace concerns. There were questions about her performance. There were moments when she was regarded as careless. Yet none of those warning signs immediately revealed the truth. There was nothing written across her face that announced what she would eventually become. She could still enter a facility as a nurse. She could still approach patients. She could still move through the environment without immediately attracting the kind of suspicion that follows an obvious criminal. And that is one of the most important details in understanding this case. Elizabeth Wettlaufer did not need to become invisible. She needed to remain ordinary. Ordinary was enough. A nurse entering a patient's room is ordinary. A nurse handling medication is ordinary. A nurse checking on an elderly patient is ordinary. A nurse being present when a patient becomes sick is ordinary. A nurse being present when an elderly patient dies is, sadly, ordinary too. That was the environment in which the crimes occurred. Between 2007 and 2016, Wettlaufer was responsible for a series of acts that would eventually be recognized as one of the most disturbing healthcare crimes in Canadian history. She used excessive insulin to harm patients. 8 people were ultimately identified as murder victims. 4 additional people were connected to attempted murder charges. 2 others were victims of aggravated assault. 14 serious criminal charges. But the number alone cannot explain the horror. 8. 14. Those are numbers investigators can write on a page. Families do not experience numbers. They experience absence. An empty chair. A room that is suddenly too quiet. A photograph that becomes painful to look at. A telephone that will never ring with that person's voice again. The people who died were elderly and vulnerable. Many were living in long-term care facilities in southwestern Ontario. Their lives had already reached a stage where they depended on other people for essential care. That dependence is what makes the case so disturbing. A vulnerable patient cannot simply stand up and walk away when something feels wrong. A person with severe illness may not understand why they suddenly feel weak. A person with cognitive impairment may not be able to describe what is happening. A person who has spent years trusting medical professionals may not question the treatment they are receiving. And even if a patient had been able to question it, why would they suspect the nurse? Why would they look at the person wearing the uniform and think, "You are here to hurt me"? Trust changes perception. It lowers suspicion. It opens doors. And Elizabeth Wettlaufer had those doors opened for her. The weapon in this story was not something that immediately looked like a weapon. It was insulin. Something associated with medicine. Something that belongs in a healthcare environment. Something that can be used legitimately to treat patients. That is part of what made the crime so difficult to recognize. There was no obvious act of violence that necessarily announced itself as murder. There was a medical environment. There was a patient. There was medication. And then there was deterioration. In a long-term care facility, deterioration is not unusual. An elderly person may become weaker. A chronic illness may worsen. A body may simply stop responding as it once did. When death finally comes, people may look backward and see a long medical history leading toward it. The explanation can feel complete, until someone discovers a reason to question it. For years, there was no such question. The deaths were separated from one another by time. They were surrounded by the ordinary circumstances of aging. And the person who would eventually be identified as responsible was not standing outside the institution. She was inside it. She belonged there. She was supposed to be there. That distinction may have been the greatest shield Wettlaufer had. She did not have to convince everyone she was innocent. Her profession had already given her a reason to be trusted. And when a person is trusted before anything happens, suspicion has a much harder time taking root. Think about how a family sees a nurse. They may not know her personally. They may not know where she grew up. They may not know what she does after work. They may not know what struggle she carries. But they know one thing. She is a nurse. That title carries meaning. It suggests training, responsibility, competence, care. The family does not walk into a care facility assuming that the person assigned to their loved one may be the person who causes their death. They walk in assuming the opposite. They assume the patient is safer because the nurse is there. That assumption would become one of the darkest ironies of the Wettlaufer case. Because the same system that gave patients access to care also gave Wettlaufer access to patients. The same routines designed to protect people could become the routines within which harm was hidden. And the same medical explanations that helped families understand death could make a deliberate killing look like something else. That is why the story did not begin with police. It began with silence. A patient died, then another, then another. The deaths did not immediately form a pattern. There was no investigator standing over a board covered with photographs, connecting red lines between victims. There was no detective saying that the same person had been present at every scene. Not yet. There were only individual deaths, individual families, individual medical histories, individual moments of grief. And somewhere inside those individual stories was a common element that no one yet understood. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. For nearly a decade, that connection remained hidden. Then came September 2016. The moment that changed everything did not begin with an arrest. It began with Wettlaufer herself. She left nursing and entered the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. There, she began speaking about what she had done. She told a psychiatrist that she had harmed and killed patients using excessive insulin. For investigators, this would become the doorway into a past they had not known existed. But a confession alone could not simply be accepted without question. Police needed to know whether the story was true. They needed to test it. They needed to reconstruct it. And then Wettlaufer did something that made the confession even more significant. She wrote it down. A handwritten confession of approximately 4 pages. 4 pages. A small amount of paper compared with the number of lives that would eventually become connected to it. But those pages changed the meaning of years of death. Suddenly, investigators had a reason to look backward. They could no longer treat every death as an isolated event. They had to ask whether the same person had been present before multiple deaths. They had to examine the places where Wettlaufer had worked. They had to review patient records. They had to revisit deaths that had already been accepted as part of the ordinary process of aging and illness. And the further they looked, the more disturbing the picture became. The names began to emerge. James Silcox, Helen Matheson, Mary Zurowinski, Gladys Millard, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, Arpid Horvath, Lloyd Keffer. These were not just entries in an investigation. They were human beings whose lives had ended. Their families had already experienced the shock of losing them. Some had already spent years living with those losses. Now they were being forced to reconsider the final chapter of those lives. Imagine receiving that kind of news. You believed your loved one died because they were old, because they were sick, because their body had finally failed. Then investigators tell you that someone may have deliberately caused the death. The grief does not simply return. It changes shape. The memories you once held become questions. Was something strange happening that day? Did they seem different? Did anyone notice? Who was there? Who cared for them? Was there something we should have known? Could we have done anything? These are questions that can haunt families because they cannot be answered by going back in time. The past does not reopen its doors simply because investigators have discovered new evidence. The person who died cannot explain what happened, and the family can only look at memories that once seemed ordinary and wonder whether they were actually witnessing something they did not understand. That is one of the cruelest consequences of a hidden crime. It steals not only a life, it can also alter the memory of that life. And yet, there is another layer to the story. The victims were not the only people whose lives were changed. The case would eventually force Ontario to confront the way long-term care facilities identified, reported, and investigated suspicious deaths. Because Elizabeth Wettlaufer had not operated in a vacuum. She had worked inside a system with procedures, a system with supervisors, a system with records, a system with professional standards, a system that, at least in principle, was designed to protect exactly the kind of people she was accused of harming. The later public inquiry would ask a devastating question. Not simply, what did Wettlaufer do? But why was it possible for her to continue? Why did the warning signs not lead to the discovery of the killings? Why did the deaths not trigger the questions that might have exposed the pattern? And what could be changed so that another person could not exploit the same weaknesses? Those questions would eventually produce 91 recommendations. But before the recommendations came, there was the criminal investigation. Before the system could be examined, the victims had to be identified. Before the past could be understood, investigators had to enter it. They had to look at every place Wettlaufer had worked, every patient connected to her, every death that could be relevant, every medical record that might tell them something the families had never known. And every time they found another connection, the confession became harder to dismiss as the words of a troubled woman. The story was becoming a pattern. 8 murders, 4 attempted murders, 2 aggravated assaults. A period stretching from 2007 to 2016. Nearly a decade. That amount of time changes the way we think about a serial crime. It means the first victim was not the end of something. The first victim was the beginning. And somewhere after that first killing, Elizabeth Wettlaufer returned to work. She continued to move through healthcare environments. She continued to interact with vulnerable people. She continued to occupy a position in which others expected her to protect patients. The world around her continued to function. Meals were served. Medication was administered. Families visited. Patients slept. Nurses worked their shifts. And somewhere inside that ordinary rhythm, the possibility of another death existed. Then another. And another. Until finally, the woman at the center of it all walked into a mental health facility and began to tell someone what she had done. That is perhaps the strangest element of the entire case. The investigation was not born from the perfect detective. It was not born from a brilliant forensic breakthrough. It was born from a confession. The person who had spent years hidden inside the healthcare system eventually became the person who opened the door to her own crimes. But even after that confession, the truth was not immediately complete. A confession can provide a map. It cannot tell investigators what lies at every destination. They still had to travel backward. They had to verify. They had to identify. They had to prove. And as they did, they discovered that the story was larger than anyone might have imagined. Because Elizabeth Wettlaufer was not connected to a single death. She was connected to a series. Not to a single moment. To years. Not to one victim. To many. And not to one failure. To a chain of missed opportunities that would eventually become one of the central questions of the case. Could someone have stopped her earlier? Could one unexplained death have been examined differently? Could one warning sign have been taken more seriously? Could one person have asked a question that would have changed everything? There is no simple answer. And perhaps that is what makes the case so uncomfortable. It would be easy to tell a story in which one monster appears and everyone else is innocent. But reality is rarely that simple. There were institutions. There were procedures. There were people who saw individual pieces of information without seeing the whole picture. There were assumptions about aging and illness. There was the extraordinary trust placed in healthcare professionals. And there was Elizabeth Wettlaufer moving through all of it, the woman who would eventually become known as Canada's first known healthcare serial killer. The woman who spent years in a profession designed to protect vulnerable lives. The woman whose victims were not discovered because someone caught her in the act. The woman who eventually confessed. And the woman whose confession forced an entire system to look backward and ask whether the deaths it had accepted had ever been what they seemed. Because sometimes the most dangerous crime scene is not the place where violence is obvious. Sometimes it is a place where everything looks normal. A room. A bed. A medical chart. A nurse. A patient. A death. Was this really a natural death? Or had someone decided that this person's life should end? For almost 10 years, Elizabeth Wettlaufer's victims had no voice left to answer that question. In 2016, Wettlaufer gave investigators the first answer. And once they began listening, the quiet deaths of the past would become impossible to ignore. Southwestern Ontario is not the kind of place most people imagine when they hear the words serial murder. There is no obvious darkness attached to it. No isolated mountain roads. No sprawling wilderness where someone can disappear without a trace. No anonymous city block where strangers pass one another without ever knowing their names. Instead, there are communities where life moves at a familiar pace. Roads connecting small towns, residential neighborhoods, hospitals, clinics, long-term care facilities, places built around the ordinary needs of ordinary people. And inside those communities were the people Elizabeth Wettlaufer would eventually care for. They were old. They were sick. They were vulnerable. And they lived in places designed to protect them. A long-term care facility is a strange kind of world because it exists somewhere between a home and a medical institution. For some residents, it becomes home. The same corridors are walked every morning. The same doors are opened. The same faces appear at the nurse's station. Meals arrive at regular times. Medication follows a schedule. Staff members learn the small details that make one resident different from another. Someone likes their coffee a certain way. Someone needs help getting dressed. Someone becomes anxious at night. Someone needs assistance getting out of bed. Someone's family visits every Sunday. Someone else receives almost no visitors at all. Over time, these routines become predictable, and predictability can feel like safety. For an elderly person who can no longer live independently, routine may be one of the last things that gives the day a sense of order. Morning comes. Someone opens the curtains. Medication is given. Breakfast arrives. A nurse checks on the residents. People move through the building. Then lunch. Then another medication round. Then afternoon. Then evening. Then night. The same cycle repeats. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. And because the routine repeats, people learn to trust it. Families trust it. Residents trust it. Staff trust it. That trust is essential. Without it, long-term care could not function. But trust can also create blind spots. When something happens inside a familiar routine, people naturally search for the most familiar explanation. If an elderly resident becomes weak, there may already be an explanation. If a patient becomes confused, there may already be an explanation. If someone deteriorates rapidly, there may already be an explanation. And when an elderly patient dies, the death itself may not seem extraordinary. Death is a part of long-term care. That does not make it less painful. It simply means that everyone working there is surrounded by people approaching the final stages of life. The residents are not healthy young adults whose sudden deaths immediately appear impossible. They're people whose bodies may already be struggling against age and disease. Their medical histories can be long. Their medications can be numerous. Their conditions can be complicated. Their final days can be difficult to interpret. This is the environment in which Elizabeth Wettlaufer worked. She did not have to create a world of fear. She entered a world where illness and death were already present. That distinction would become critical, because the most frightening part of this story is not that death occurred in these facilities. It is that some deaths were later understood to have been caused deliberately. But at first, there was no obvious reason to think that. The environment itself provided explanations. The patients were old. They were ill. They were receiving care because they needed it. Their bodies were already fragile. And when someone becomes critically ill in such a setting, people do not automatically think of murder. They think of disease. They think of complications. They think of the patient's medical history. They think that perhaps the body has finally reached a point from which it cannot recover. This is not negligence. It is not indifference. It is the ordinary way human beings make sense of death when the circumstances appear medically plausible. That ordinary assumption would become part of the tragedy. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was born in 1967 and grew up in southwestern Ontario. Years later, she would become a registered nurse. By 1995, she had entered a profession built around responsibility. Nursing requires access. Access to patients. Access to medication. Access to private rooms. Access to medical information. Access to moments when people are at their weakest. That access exists for a reason. A nurse cannot care for a patient from a distance. The nurse has to be close. Close enough to examine the patient. Close enough to administer treatment. Close enough to notice changes. Close enough to respond when something goes wrong. The profession depends on that proximity. The patient allows the nurse into their personal space because the nurse is there to help. For an elderly resident, this relationship can become even more intimate. The nurse may help with tasks that the patient once performed independently. The nurse may assist with medication. The nurse may monitor changes in health. The nurse may be one of the people the patient sees most frequently. In time, a stranger can become a familiar face, and a familiar face can become part of the patient's idea of safety. That is the foundation on which long-term care operates. It is also the foundation that makes the Wettlaufer case so disturbing, because the person standing beside the patient's bed was supposed to represent care. Instead, that position gave her access to people who could not easily protect themselves. The patients were not simply vulnerable because they were old. They were vulnerable because their lives depended on other people. That dependency can be almost total. A resident may need someone else to help them move, someone else to bring medication, someone else to recognize that their condition has changed, someone else to speak to a doctor, someone else to tell the family what is happening. When a person is that dependent, trust becomes more than a courtesy. It becomes part of survival. And Elizabeth Wettlaufer was placed inside that relationship. She had become a nurse in a system where people were expected to trust her. Yet behind the professional identity, her life was not entirely stable. The later record of her career revealed problems. There were concerns about her performance. There were difficulties in her personal life. There were issues involving substance use and mental health. There were moments when her work was regarded as careless. Those details matter, but they must be understood carefully. They do not mean that anyone looking at Wettlaufer before the murders should automatically have known what she was capable of. A troubled employee is not necessarily a killer. A nurse who makes mistakes is not necessarily dangerous. A person struggling with addiction is not necessarily violent. A person experiencing mental health difficulties is not necessarily a threat to anyone. Those distinctions are important, because the story is not simply about obvious warning signs that everyone ignored. It is about fragments, pieces of information that existed separately. A workplace problem here, a personal problem there, a performance concern somewhere else. None of them, on their own, necessarily revealed the horrifying possibility that would eventually emerge. And while those fragments existed, Wettlaufer continued working in environments where patients depended on her. The long-term care setting itself remained largely ordinary. That is worth imagining. A hallway, doors on either side, a nurse's station, residents sitting in common areas, family members coming to visit, staff moving between rooms, medication being prepared and administered, people talking about everyday things, people worrying about appointments, people waiting for dinner, people asking what time their family would arrive. Life did not stop because a crime was occurring. That may be one of the hardest things to understand about hidden crimes. The world around them continues. A person can be committing something terrible while everyone else is still having an ordinary day. Someone may be laughing in another room. A family may be visiting a loved one. A staff member may be discussing a patient's condition. A television may be playing. A meal may be served. And in another room, an act may be taking place that nobody else understands. There is no dramatic sign separating the ordinary from the horrific. That boundary exists only in retrospect. Before investigators knew what had happened, a nurse walking into a patient's room looked like a nurse doing her job. After the investigation, the same image became something else. The room could no longer be viewed in quite the same way. The routine could no longer be considered completely harmless. The presence of the nurse could no longer be interpreted only as protection. That transformation is one of the most powerful aspects of the case. The past does not change, but its meaning does. The hallway remains the same. The building remains the same. The records remain the same. The people who died remain dead. What changes is what everyone knows. Before the confession, a death might have seemed like the final stage of illness. After the confession, investigators had to ask whether someone had deliberately caused it. That single question changes everything. It changes how you look at a medical record. It changes how you look at medication. It changes how you remember a final visit. It changes how a family remembers the last person who cared for their loved one. And it changes how an institution understands its own routines. For years, the system had been built around the assumption that the people administering care were there to provide care. That assumption was necessary, but it also meant that the possibility of deliberate harm from within the system was difficult to imagine. The danger did not look like danger. It looked like a nurse. That is perhaps the central image of this entire case. Not a shadowy figure standing outside. Not someone hiding from cameras. Not someone breaking into a building. A nurse walking through a corridor. A nurse entering a room. A nurse approaching a patient. A nurse performing tasks that were completely normal within the environment. The ordinary appearance of those actions was what made them so difficult to distinguish from legitimate care. And the patients themselves were among the least able to challenge what was happening. An elderly resident might not understand a medical decision. They might not remember what medication they had received. They might not recognize that something had been done differently. They might feel ill without understanding why. And even if they did notice something, the person they might have turned to for help could be the same person causing the harm. That is an extraordinary imbalance of power. One person depends on another. One person has medical knowledge. The other may have almost none. One person has access to medication. The other receives it. One person understands what is happening. The other may simply trust. In a healthy healthcare relationship, that imbalance is controlled by ethics, professional standards, supervision, accountability, and the assumption that the caregiver is acting in the patient's best interest. But when one caregiver deliberately violates that trust, the entire relationship becomes vulnerable. This is why the Wetlaufer case eventually became larger than a criminal prosecution. The question was no longer only what one woman had done. It became a question about the environment in which she had done it. The long-term care system would later be examined through a public inquiry. The inquiry would ask how the crimes had been able to continue. It would examine the systems intended to protect residents. It would produce 91 recommendations. But in the years before that examination, there were only ordinary facilities filled with ordinary routines. And inside those routines, Wetlaufer moved from one workplace to another. She had been working in healthcare for years. She knew the language. She knew the expectations. She understood what patients and families expected from nurses. She understood how illness looked. She understood how medication was administered. She understood the vulnerability of the people under her care. And she understood the institutional environment around them. The first known killings connected to her began in 2007. At that point, there was no public story about Elizabeth Wetlaufer. There was no widespread fear attached to her name. She was not a notorious criminal. She was a nurse. The residents around her did not know they were standing near someone who would eventually become associated with multiple deaths. Families did not know. The wider healthcare system did not know. The public did not know. The years continued. 2007. Then later years. Then more patients. Then more deaths. And because the crimes were spread over time, the pattern did not necessarily reveal itself as it might have if everything had happened within 1 week or 1 month. Time can hide connections. Distance can hide connections. Different facilities can hide connections. Different patients can hide connections. And age and illness can hide connections better than almost anything else. That is what made this setting so important. The environment did not merely provide Wetlaufer with access. It provided context. It provided plausible explanations. It provided routine. And routine is powerful. People rarely stop to question every ordinary action. They do not ask why a nurse entered a room at the expected time. They do not wonder why medication was administered during a medication round. They do not assume that a medical professional has deliberately chosen to harm someone. The system is built on the opposite assumption. Trust first. Question later. Elizabeth Wetlaufer exploited that trust. At least, that is what the later investigation would reveal. But during the years when the crimes were occurring, the people inside those facilities were simply living their lives. They were eating, sleeping, waiting for family visits, talking to staff, remembering the past, coping with the present, and facing the future. For some residents, The future was measured in years. For others, perhaps months. For some, perhaps only days. No one knew exactly when the end would come. But everyone understood that it would come eventually. That awareness can make death seem less suspicious in a long-term care environment. When a patient has been ill for years, the final decline can appear inevitable. When a patient has lived to an advanced age, death can seem like the natural conclusion of a long life. And when the medical environment confirms that expectation, families may have no reason to imagine something darker. That is why the victims deserve to be remembered as more than people who died in a nursing facility. They were people who had reached the stage of life where they needed help. They entered a system because they believed that help was available. Their families entrusted them to professionals. And for the most part, that system exists because countless healthcare workers genuinely care for vulnerable people every day. That distinction matters too. The existence of one healthcare serial killer does not define every nurse. In fact, the horror of Wettlaufer's crimes is partly created by how much they violate what nursing is supposed to represent. Care, protection, responsibility, compassion. The betrayal is so profound because the role itself carries an expectation of trust. That is why the setting matters. Before we can understand the investigation, we have to understand the world in which the crimes disappeared. A world where death was not unusual. A world where illness was expected. A world where medication was routine. A world where nurses were trusted. A world where families believed their loved ones were being cared for. And a world where one woman could walk into that environment carrying the authority of a healthcare professional. For years, nobody outside the immediate circle of her work knew what was happening. There was no headline announcing a killer in the facility. There was no warning to families. There was no public panic. The residents continued to live their lives. And Wettlaufer continued to appear as part of the machinery of care. That is what makes the story so haunting. The machinery was functioning. The doors opened. The medication rounds happened. The staff worked. The families visited. The residents slept. And somewhere within that functioning system, something had gone terribly wrong. The danger was not standing outside the building. It was already inside, and it had been given permission to enter. Permission granted by a profession, by an institution, by trust. And, most importantly, by the assumption that the person wearing the uniform had come to help. The patients could not know that assumption would eventually become the very thing that made them vulnerable. Their stories were about to intersect with Elizabeth Wettlaufer's. And when that happened, the ordinary world of long-term care would become the backdrop to a series of deaths that would remain hidden for years. But to understand what was taken from those victims, we first have to slow down. We have to leave the institutional corridors for a moment. We have to stop thinking about numbers. We have to stop thinking about charges. We have to stop thinking about the woman who committed the crimes. And we have to look at the people who were there first, the people whose lives existed long before their names appeared in an investigation. The people who entered long-term care because they needed protection. The people who trusted the hands that cared for them. The people whose final days were supposed to be surrounded by dignity. Because before they became victims, they were someone's family. And that is where the next part of this story begins. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside a long-term care facility. It is not the silence of an empty building. It is the opposite. There are always people somewhere nearby. A door opens. A wheelchair moves slowly along a corridor. Someone calls for assistance. A television is playing in another room. A nurse walks past carrying a chart. A resident waits for breakfast. A family member arrives with a coat folded over one arm and a small bag of personal belongings in the other. There are conversations, questions, medications, meals, appointments, and routines. Life is happening, but beneath all of it is an awareness that makes these places different from ordinary homes. Many of the people living there are nearing the final stage of their lives. Some have spent decades being independent. They raised children. They worked. They drove cars. They owned homes. They made decisions for themselves. Then slowly something changed. A body became weaker. Memory became less reliable. Walking became difficult. Medication became more complicated. A spouse could no longer provide all the care that was needed. A son or daughter began making decisions that a parent had once made alone. Eventually, the family arrived at a decision that few people make easily. Their loved one needed professional care. And that decision came with an invisible promise. We are putting you somewhere safe. That promise matters. It matters to the resident. It matters to the family. And it matters to the people who work inside the facility. Because nursing is not simply a job where someone performs a series of medical tasks. It is a relationship built around dependence. A patient gives the nurse access to their body, their room, their medical information, their fears, their confusion, their weakness, and sometimes the final moments of their life. A nurse may be one of the last people a patient sees before falling asleep. One of the first people they see when they wake. One of the people who notices that their breathing has changed. One of the people who decides that something is wrong and needs attention. That kind of access is extraordinary. But inside a healthcare facility, it does not look extraordinary. It looks normal. That is the first thing that makes the story of Elizabeth Wettlaufer so difficult to understand. She did not need special permission to enter a patient's room. She did not need to invent a reason to be there. She already had one. She was a nurse. When she walked down a hallway, no one needed to ask why. When she approached a patient, no one needed to know her intentions. When she handled medication, it was part of the job. When a patient became unwell, her presence was expected. When a patient died, the fact that she had been nearby did not automatically make her suspicious. She was exactly where a nurse was supposed to be. That ordinary fact would eventually become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because the same professional role that was designed to protect vulnerable people also gave Wettlaufer access to them. She had entered a profession where trust was built into the uniform. And she wore that uniform for years. Elizabeth Wettlaufer became a registered nurse in 1995. By the time the crimes later attributed to her began in 2007, she was not a newcomer to the healthcare world. She had experience. She understood the routines. She knew how patients behaved. She knew what illness could look like. She knew what deterioration could look like. She knew how medication was administered. And she knew what happened when an elderly person's condition suddenly changed. That knowledge is not sinister by itself. It is exactly the knowledge a competent nurse is supposed to have. The problem was what happened when that knowledge existed inside the mind of someone who chose to violate the trust placed in her. The patients she encountered were often much older than she was. Their lives had unfolded over decades before she ever entered them. Some had spent their younger years working, raising families, building homes, creating memories that had nothing to do with medicine or nursing homes. By the time Wettlaufer met them, much of that history was no longer visible. An elderly person can be reduced, in the eyes of an institution, to a room number and a medical chart, a diagnosis, a medication schedule, a dietary requirement, a mobility level, a list of allergies, a note about whether they require assistance. But none of those things explains who the person actually was. A chart does not tell you what someone's laugh sounded like. It does not tell you what song they loved when they were 20. It does not tell you what their children remember about them. It does not tell you what kind of parent they were. It does not tell you what they feared. It does not tell you what they still hoped for. And it certainly does not tell you how much their family would miss them. Inside a long-term care facility, however, the medical chart has an enormous influence. It tells staff what has happened, what medication is required, what symptoms have been observed, what changes have occurred, what should be monitored. The chart becomes a record of the patient's condition. And when a patient becomes sick, the record provides context. This is important because context can make a death seem understandable. An elderly patient who has multiple health problems can become critically ill without anyone immediately thinking that a crime has occurred. There are many possible explanations. The body may be failing. An illness may have progressed. A complication may have developed. A medication may have produced an unexpected reaction. The patient may simply have reached the end of their life. That does not mean staff do not care. It means that medicine exists in a world of probabilities. Healthcare workers make decisions based on information. They see symptoms. They consider medical histories. They look for explanations. And when the patient is already extremely vulnerable, the line between natural deterioration and something deliberately caused can be difficult to recognize. That was the environment Wettlaufer entered. The deaths did not need to look dramatic. They needed to look plausible. And an elderly patient becoming seriously ill inside a long-term care facility was, tragically, plausible. That is why the location matters. A serial killer in a forest creates a different kind of investigation. A serial killer in a hospital or nursing facility creates a problem that is much harder to see. The environment itself explains away many things. A patient is weak because they are old. A patient is confused because they have cognitive problems. A patient is unstable because they're already sick. A patient dies because their body has failed. Each explanation may be reasonable. Each explanation may be correct. But if someone is deliberately causing the deterioration, those same explanations can become a shield. Wettlaufer understood the environment in which she worked. She knew that illness had a language. She knew that healthcare professionals were trained to interpret symptoms through medical explanations. She knew that patients in long-term care were already medically complicated. And she knew that insulin belonged in that world. Insulin is not something that would automatically look suspicious inside a healthcare facility. It is medication. It has a legitimate medical purpose. It exists because some patients need it. That is precisely why the method connected to Wettlaufer's crimes was so disturbing. Excessive insulin could produce severe hypoglycemia. The patient could become dangerously ill. And in a vulnerable elderly person, the consequences could be fatal. There was no need for an object that looked like a murder weapon. The medication itself could be enough. That difference matters. Because when people imagine murder, they often imagine violence that announces itself. A wound. Blood. A struggle. A broken door. A weapon left behind. Something that immediately tells everyone who sees it that a crime has occurred. But healthcare can hide violence behind procedure. A needle can be part of legitimate treatment. A medication can be part of legitimate treatment. A nurse can be part of legitimate care. The outward appearance may remain completely ordinary. The difference is hidden inside intention. Two nurses can perform the same action. One is trying to save a patient. The other may be trying to harm one. From a distance, the action may look identical. Only the intention is different. And intention is invisible. That is one of the most frightening ideas at the center of this case. Wettlaufer did not need to appear threatening. She needed to appear competent enough to remain inside the system. And that is why her professional identity mattered so much. The uniform was not simply clothing. It was authority. It told patients and families that this person had been trained. It told them that this person knew what she was doing. It told them that if something went wrong, she was one of the people who could help. The patient did not have the medical knowledge to independently verify every decision. The family often did not have the opportunity to observe every moment of care. The institution relied on its employees to perform their responsibilities properly. That creates layers of trust. Patient trusts nurse. Family trusts facility. Facility trusts employee. And when one person breaks that chain, the damage can spread through every layer. This is what makes the Wettlaufer case more than a story about one individual. The individual matters. Her decisions matter. Her motives matter. Her actions matter. But the environment matters too. Because the environment determined how much access she had. It determined how vulnerable the victims were. It determined how normal a patient's deterioration might appear. And it determined how difficult it could be to distinguish deliberate harm from the ordinary tragedies of aging. Wettlaufer's career also did not exist without problems. There were concerns about her performance. There were difficulties in her personal life. There were issues involving substance use and mental health. There were concerns about her conduct and competence. But those warning signs must be viewed without the distortion of hindsight. Knowing what she eventually did makes every earlier problem look darker. It is tempting to look backward and say that the signs were obvious. But they were not necessarily obvious at the time. A nurse struggling with addiction does not automatically become a murderer. A nurse struggling with mental health does not automatically become dangerous. A nurse making mistakes does not automatically become a serial killer. A troubled employee can simply be a troubled employee. That is why the system's failure cannot be explained by saying that everyone should have somehow known. People did not have the full picture. They had fragments, and fragments are difficult to interpret. One concern here, another concern there. A problem that seems isolated. A mistake that appears unrelated. A difficult employee. A personal crisis. Nothing necessarily connects those pieces until someone knows what the completed picture looks like. Only afterward does the pattern become visible. And by then, the damage may already have been done. Between 2007 and 2016, Wettlaufer was connected to a series of killings and other serious assaults. But the years did not announce themselves as a continuous crime. 2007 did not arrive with a warning that this was the beginning of a 9-year pattern. The next year did not carry a label. Neither did the years after that. There was no calendar on the wall telling anyone that a terrible sequence had begun. There were simply patients, and then there were deaths, then other patients, and more deaths. Time separated the events. Different people separated the events. Different circumstances surrounded the deaths. The victims were elderly. Their medical histories were complicated. The environment was accustomed to death. All of that created distance between one event and another. And distance makes patterns harder to recognize. Imagine looking at a single point through a window. It means almost nothing. Then another point appears far away. Still nothing. Then another. Only when you step backward do you realize the points form a line. Investigators eventually had to step backward. But they could not do that until they had a reason. For years, they did not. Then came the confession. In September 2016, Wettlaufer entered the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. There, she began talking about what she had done. She told a psychiatrist that she had harmed and killed patients using excessive insulin. And then she wrote a confession of roughly 4 pages. She voluntarily gave that confession to police and answered questions. This was the moment when the entire landscape changed. Suddenly, investigators had a reason to look at the old deaths differently. They had to revisit facilities where Wettlaufer had worked. They had to examine patient records. They had to reconstruct her movements. They had to identify which patients had been under her care. They had to determine whether the events she described could be verified. And they had to confront the possibility that the long-term care environment had hidden a series of murders in plain sight. The investigation eventually identified 8 murder victims: James Silcox, Helen Matheson, Mary Zerwinski, Gladys Millard, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, Arpid Horvath, Lloyd Keffer. They ranged from approximately 75 to 96 years old. They were people who had reached the stage of life where they depended on others. And that dependence is perhaps the most important part of the setting. They could not simply leave. They could not easily choose another caregiver in the middle of a medical crisis. They could not independently control every medication they received. They relied on professionals to understand what their bodies were telling them. They relied on nurses to notice deterioration. They relied on staff to protect them. And they relied on the system to notice if something went wrong. Wettlaufer was operating inside that dependency. She did not have to overpower her victims physically. She did not have to chase them. She did not have to hide them. She only had to be present in the role she had already been assigned. That is an important distinction. Her greatest advantage was not physical strength. It was legitimacy. She belonged there. The victims knew she belonged there. The institution knew she belonged there. Families expected her to be there. Her presence was not suspicious. Her presence was reassuring. And that is precisely what made the betrayal so profound. When a stranger harms you, the fear comes from discovering that someone dangerous exists in the world. When a caregiver harms you, the fear comes from discovering that the person you were told to trust was the danger. Those are very different forms of terror. One destroys your sense of safety outside. The other destroys your sense of safety inside. And in long-term care, inside is everything. The building becomes home. The staff become familiar. The routines become familiar. The faces become familiar. A resident may spend more time with caregivers than with family. For some residents, the nurse is one of the most important people in their daily lives. A nurse may adjust a blanket, help someone sit upright, give medication, check a wound, measure a vital sign, answer a question, listen to a complaint, tell someone that their daughter has arrived. Small actions, ordinary actions, actions that, taken together, create the feeling of being cared for. That is what makes Wetlaufer's crimes so difficult to separate from the idea of care itself. She did not simply enter the victims' lives. She entered through the very door marked care. And once the door was open, the victims had little reason to question why she was there. For years, this environment remained intact. Patients continued to depend on staff. Families continued to trust facilities. Nurses continued their work. And Wetlaufer continued moving through the system. Then, everything changed. Her confession forced investigators to look backward. The deaths that once seemed separate began to sit beside one another. The old records gained new meaning. The names of patients became names of potential victims. The years began to connect, and the ordinary setting of long-term care became something investigators had to examine from a completely different perspective. A hallway was no longer just a hallway. A medication round was no longer simply a medication round. A nurse's presence was no longer automatically reassuring. Every detail had to be reconsidered. Not because every nurse was dangerous, not because every death was suspicious, but because investigators now knew that deliberate harm had occurred inside a system where people had assumed they were safe. That knowledge changes the way a place feels. The building itself may look exactly the same doors, the same windows, the same rooms, the same corridors. But the meaning has changed. The place that once represented care now also represents betrayal. And for the families of the victims, that betrayal would become part of their grief. They had entrusted someone with the care of a person they loved. They believed the person was being protected. They believed the final days were being managed by professionals. Then they learned that some of those deaths had been caused deliberately. That realization could not be undone. Even if the institution continued operating, even if new nurses arrived, even if new procedures were introduced, the memory remained. Because once trust is broken in a place where people are most vulnerable, rebuilding it is never as simple as changing a policy. The story of Elizabeth Wetlaufer would eventually lead to a public inquiry and major recommendations for Ontario's long-term care system. But those reforms came after the victims were gone. They came after the confession, after the investigation, after the arrests, after the courtroom. The residents who died did not get to benefit from those changes. Their families had to live with the knowledge of what happened. And the system had to confront a question that no long-term care facility ever wants to ask. What happens when the person responsible for caring for the vulnerable becomes the person who harms them? There is no comfortable answer, because the entire structure depends on trust. You cannot build a healthcare system without trust. Patients must trust nurses. Families must trust caregivers. Institutions must trust employees. But trust without effective oversight can become dangerous. And oversight without awareness can become a set of procedures that exist on paper but fail to recognize what is happening in reality. The Wetlaufer case exposed that tension in the most painful possible way. The system had rules. The system had professionals. The system had records. The system had people whose job was to care. And still, a woman could move through that system while carrying a secret that would eventually connect her to 8 murders and other serious assaults. The victims were not taken from their homes by force. They were not abducted. They were already where they were supposed to be. They were already inside the place that was supposed to protect them. That is what makes the setting so important. Before we move into the individual lives of the victims, we have to understand the world they entered. A world of routines. A world of dependence. A world where medicine and mortality exist side by side. A world where an elderly person's death may seem inevitable. A world where the person standing beside the bed is trusted almost automatically. In a world where Elizabeth Wettlaufer learned how to move unnoticed, the horror did not begin with a scream. It began with a normal shift, a normal hallway, a normal patient, a normal nurse. And then, somewhere inside that normality, something changed. A dose was no longer simply a dose. A medication was no longer simply medication. A caregiver was no longer simply a caregiver. But nobody knew that yet. Not the families. Not the residents. Not the public. Not the investigators. And perhaps not even the system itself. For years, the truth remained buried beneath the ordinary explanations that surrounded elderly death. Age, illness, frailty, complication, time. Those explanations were familiar. They were comfortable because they made sense. But the truth waiting underneath them was not comfortable. The truth was that someone had entered rooms where vulnerable people were sleeping and used access granted by a profession of care to cause harm. And before anyone could understand why, they first had to understand where. They had to understand the world of long-term care. The corridors, the routines, the trust, the dependence, the quiet acceptance that death could happen at any time. Because that was the world in which Elizabeth Wettlaufer found the perfect camouflage. She did not need darkness. She had something much more effective: normality. And while everyone else saw a nurse beginning another shift, the people she would eventually harm had no reason to know that the person approaching them might be carrying something far more dangerous than medicine. They only knew that she was there to care for them, and they trusted her. That trust would become the doorway through which the next chapter of the story would unfold. Because behind every medical chart was a person. Behind every room number was a life. And behind every death was a family that believed it understood what had happened. Until one day, years later, someone came forward and forced the entire system to look again. There was another reason Elizabeth Wettlaufer could move through this world without immediately appearing out of place. She knew how to belong. She understood the language of nursing. She understood the rhythm of a shift. She understood what patients expected when a nurse entered their room, and what families expected when they asked how their loved one was doing. For more than a decade, she had been part of that world. She became a registered nurse in 1995, long before anyone would know her name for the reasons that would eventually make it infamous. By 2007, the period in which the killings later attributed to her began, she was already an experienced healthcare worker. That matters because experience changes the way a person moves through an institution. A new nurse may hesitate. They may check instructions twice. They may ask questions. They may still be learning where everything is kept and how every procedure is performed. An experienced nurse moves differently. They know which door leads where. They know the routines. They understand the expectations. They know how to communicate with coworkers. They know how patients behave when they're frightened. They know what families want to hear. They know when a change in a patient's condition is significant and when it might be part of a longer medical decline. And Wettlaufer had spent years learning those things. The disturbing reality is that the same experience that should have made her a better caregiver also gave her an understanding of the environment she would later exploit. But there is an important distinction. The evidence does not support the idea that everyone around her simply ignored an obvious monster. Wettlaufer was not an employee about whom nobody had ever raised concerns. There had been problems. There were concerns about her performance and professional conduct. Some people had noticed that she could be careless or behave inappropriately. Her personal life also contained serious difficulties, including issues involving substance use and mental health. Those details would become important when investigators and later reviewers tried to understand how she had continued working. But there was a gap between recognizing that someone was struggling and imagining that the person was deliberately killing patients. That gap is where this story becomes much more complicated. Imagine being a coworker. You see someone making mistakes. You notice that they seem distracted. You hear about difficulties in their personal life. You may become frustrated. You may wonder whether they are reliable enough. You may think they need supervision. You may believe that someone should intervene professionally. But would you look at that person and imagine 8 murders? Would you believe that the nurse standing beside an elderly patient's bed was intentionally trying to cause that patient's death? Most people would not. Not because they are foolish, because the human mind does not naturally jump from ordinary workplace problems to serial murder. There is a psychological distance between the two, and that distance allowed Wetlaufer to remain, for years, inside a system that depended on people believing she was there to provide care. The later investigation would reveal that existing oversight mechanisms were not enough to identify someone who deliberately intended to cause fatal harm. The system was capable of identifying certain kinds of problems. It could notice performance issues. It could respond to misconduct. It could respond to professional concerns. But identifying a healthcare worker who was intentionally harming patients required something very different. It required people to imagine a possibility that seemed almost impossible, that a nurse could use the tools of care as instruments of death. And that is not an easy possibility for any institution to imagine. Healthcare systems are built around the assumption that the people working inside them are trying to help. That assumption is necessary for the system to function. If every nurse had to be treated as a potential murderer, healthcare would collapse under its own suspicion. Trust is necessary. But when a person deliberately violates that trust, the very structure built to protect patients can become the structure that gives the offender access to them. Wetlaufer did not have to fight her way into the lives of the victims. She was invited, not personally, not knowingly, but professionally. The institution opened the door because she was a nurse. The patient accepted her because she was a nurse. The family accepted her because she was a nurse. And the system assumed that her decisions were being made in the patient's best interests. That is an extraordinary amount of trust to place in one person. But it is also unavoidable in healthcare. When an elderly patient needs help, someone has to come close. Someone has to touch them. Someone has to administer medication. Someone has to monitor them. Someone has to recognize when they are getting worse. Someone has to make decisions. The patient cannot always do those things for themselves. That is why long-term care exists. It is supposed to take vulnerability and surround it with protection. For the residents connected to Wetlaufer, however, that vulnerability became part of the danger. The victims were between approximately 75 and 96 years old. Some were living in long-term care. Their bodies were already fragile. Their dependence on caregivers was real. They could need help taking medication. They could need help moving. They could need someone to notice that they were becoming unwell. They could need someone to report that change to a physician or another member of the healthcare team. In other words, they depended on the very system through which Wetlaufer had access to them. And dependence creates an unusual kind of vulnerability. A healthy adult can question. A healthy adult can leave. A healthy adult can decide that something feels wrong and seek another opinion. A severely frail, elderly patient may not have those options. They may not understand what medication they are receiving. They may not remember what happened earlier in the day. They may not have the physical strength to resist. They may not even have the words to explain that something is wrong. That does not mean every elderly patient is helpless. It means that many residents in long-term care depend on professional caregivers in ways that most people outside that environment rarely experience. Their safety is intertwined with someone else's decisions. That makes professional ethics more than an abstract principle. It becomes a matter of life and death. And Wetlaufer was operating in that exact space. She did not need to overpower her victims. She did not need to threaten them. She did not need to persuade them to follow her somewhere. She was already where they were. That is perhaps the most unsettling image to carry forward. A patient in a room. A nurse entering. The nurse belongs there. The patient expects help. The nurse has the authority to provide treatment. Nothing about the scene necessarily looks wrong. That is how the crimes could exist inside ordinary life. The environment itself concealed the extraordinary nature of what was happening. Long-term care is full of medical uncertainty. A patient can have good days and bad days. A person can appear stable in the morning and become seriously ill later. An elderly body can react unpredictably to illness. A chronic condition can suddenly worsen. Medications can interact. Complications can appear. There are countless reasons why a vulnerable patient might deteriorate. This creates a difficult investigative environment. When a person is young and healthy and suddenly dies without explanation, people may immediately ask why. When a person in their 90s, already suffering from multiple medical problems, becomes critically ill, the death can appear to fit the expected course of events. The difference is not compassion. The difference is context. The context makes death appear less unusual. And that context was everywhere around Wetlaufer. She worked among people for whom death was an ever-present possibility. That does not make death meaningless. For families, it is never meaningless, but within the institution, death can become part of the rhythm of the work. Staff members grieve. Families grieve. Residents grieve. But then the facility continues. The room must be cleaned. The bed must eventually be prepared. Another resident may need that space. The next medication round still has to happen.